Well, increasingly more Americans are wanting a third party. People are sick of our two-party system, Democrats, Republicans, feeling like they're two sides of the same coin, or some are just feeling like they're too polarized. You've got people feeling various things. You've got some people thinking one and the same, some people thinking they're too polarized, I want something in the center. So you've got all of these different feelings, but many Americans are now saying that they would like to see a third party really rise up and challenge the two-party system. Unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but a two-party system in America is, as of right now, entrenched in the Constitution, entrenched in the legal system that we have, how it's set up, the voting system, and there really is no way to have a rising third party challenge the two-party system. Now, I'm going to explain this. It's going to get a little bit complicated, but I'm going to do my best to explain why this is, and then explain what can we do about it and what would be the benefit of a third party. I'm not saying that a third party should not rise up, but a third party would not be able to rise up and actually win the presidency at this point, the way that our laws are the way that our elections are run, unfortunately. So over the weekend, Trump spoke at CPAC. He said that he is not going to be starting a third party in America. My guess is somebody sat him down and said this is why a third party would not work. And that is why the only avenue in is to hijack one of the two current parties. As we saw, Bernie Sanders attempted to hijack the Democratic Party, and Trump successfully hijacked the Republican Party. And really, that's the only path forward at this point, is to hijack one of the two main political parties. Now, here's the reason. It used to not always be this way. And actually, the Republican Party was the last successful third party to rise up and overtake another party. It used to be the Democrats and the Whigs, and then the Republican Party was a third party that ultimately rose up, gained enough momentum, became extremely popular, and now it's Democrats and Republicans. For another third party to do that, to sort of rise up and take over, it's nearly impossible, because lawmakers were clever in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and they said, wait a minute, we don't want our power challenged. And so they ingrained into the laws, essentially making it nearly impossible for a third party to happen. So there's numerous issues with starting a third party in America. One of the big issues that a lot of people talk about, and this is kind of the only thing they do talk about, which is the spoiler effect, right? So they say, well, a third party can't rise up because ultimately what happens is people naturally don't want to vote for a spoiler. They want to vote for somebody who actually has a chance at winning. So they're sort of turned off by the idea of voting for this third party person who aligns, let's say 80% or 70% with one of the other two major parties. They would rather just vote for one of the two major parties and have a guaranteed win, rather than split the vote and allow the third party, the other party, to rise up and win. We saw this happen with Teddy Roosevelt when he started the Progressive Party, when Teddy Roosevelt, who had already served as president, was an extremely popular president. Taft then became the Republican president. He didn't end up liking Taft's policies. He decided to challenge Taft. So Teddy Roosevelt started the Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party. And ultimately what happened was Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, they combined, received the majority of the votes over Woodrow Wilson. However, they split those votes. And because their votes were split, Woodrow Wilson ended up being president of the United States. He was unpopular then. He ended up being a very unpopular president. And had Teddy Roosevelt not challenged Taft, and had they not split that vote, either Teddy Roosevelt or Taft would have been president of the United States and not Woodrow Wilson. So that is the fear that a lot of people have when it comes to starting a third party, is kind of getting over that mental block, right? That mental block of, I don't want to vote for the spoiler, because if I vote for the spoiler, then I'm wasting my vote. I'm throwing my vote away. And a lot of people who support the idea of a third party spend a lot of time combating that issue. They say, yeah, but if we all voted for that person, then they wouldn't be a spoiler, right? And that makes a lot of sense. That actually, it's very logical. If we all voted for this third party candidate and we didn't vote for one of the other two majors, then that person would get the majority of our votes and we'd be good to go. The problem is that's not the only problem. That is one of the roadblocks. That is the most common thought about roadblock, but there's actually numerous other roadblocks to successfully starting a third party in this country. One of the big roadblocks is the fact that we have a winner-take-all system, and we have a majority needed system when it comes to the Electoral College for President of the United States. As of right now, you have to receive, if you're going to win the presidential election, you have to receive 270 Electoral College votes in order to be president of the United States. If there's three parties, let's say we do have a party that rises up. Let's say it's the Movement for a People's Party. Let's say they are able to build a left-right coalition. I know that they're starting to work on that. My big criticism of them was that they were too far to the left and they needed to kind of bring in somehow people from the right. Not saying they need to become a centrist party, but it's about language, and it's about using certain language that is going to attract people on both sides of the aisle. And I felt like they were only using language that would only attract people from the left, and that it was alienating of people from the right. But I think they're trying to fix that. I think they're trying to be more of a coalition for both groups that have shared values. So let's say this Movement for a People's Party rises up and becomes a real contender, and they get a really good presidential candidate, and everybody wants to vote for that person. And so we go to the election, and they've got a real shot. And let's say the vote is split three ways. Let's say the movement actually gains a lot of steam, and rather than it being, fairly 50-50 with the Electoral College vote, instead it's actually split three ways, and pretty evenly three ways, right? The big question then is what happens there? Unfortunately, even if the People's Party movement candidate gained the majority of the Electoral College votes, if they still are unable to get to that 270 number, then guess what happens to the vote according to our Constitution? It goes to the House of Representatives. So then the House of Representatives gets to decide who's president of the United States if there is no clear majority winner of the Electoral College. And the way it works in the House of Representatives is at that point is they would, each state gets a vote, not each rep, not each House member, each state. So California gets one vote, even though California has the majority of House reps. California gets one vote, and Alaska, which only has one electoral college vote, also gets one vote. Every state in the union gets one vote. They vote together collectively as a body. So all of the House members from California get together. They all cast their vote. Inevitably, let's say they would all vote for the Democrat candidate, and that would be the person who gets the California vote. And then in Idaho, where I'm from, they would all get together, the 3 or 4 electoral college, or however many reps are in the state of Idaho. I don't know how many House reps they have. Not very many. Get together and they say who, and then they say, okay, the Republican candidate. And it goes like this state by state by state. In that scenario right now, if it were a 50-50 situation and there was like a third party spoiler that just sort of took some of the votes, but you've got a majority for Democrats and Republicans. Right now, there are more red states than there are blue states. So if it got to that point, then a Republican would end up being president almost 100% of the time. In this situation where if there's a third party and people rise up, then, once again, you're beholden to the House members, and the House members, especially if they're Republican or Democrat, they're going to vote for one of the two major parties. They're not going to vote for the third party candidate. So we've got an issue when it comes to what happens if you split that electoral college vote. You would need, and it's possible. Look, it's possible. You could get a third party to rise up, and that third party could become so ultimately popular that third party takes 270 electoral college votes, right? You could potentially, theoretically, have that happen. Well, this takes me to the third reason why it's nearly impossible to have a third party, and that is ballot access. The issue is if you could get a party so popular that they would command 270 electoral college votes to defeat the other two to defeat the other two major parties, you would at least need to be able to get them. You need to put them on the ballot in order to get them in order for you and I to vote for them, right? Well, ballot access is the third reason why starting a third party in America is nearly impossible. Back in the 1800s, before the late I think it was in about 1880s, 1890s, there was a big change, sort of a voting electoral system shift, a reform that happened. Prior to that point, political parties, there were many political parties. There was usually, a couple of major ones, but there were smaller ones that cropped up. And a lot of times they grew larger and larger, and they were able to overtake other ones. Like I said, the Republican Party was able to do this. During the time of Abraham Lincoln, when he ran for president, there was 4 political parties that were on the ballot. 4 of them, when you look at the election of Abraham Lincoln, you'll find that there were 4 main candidates. Abraham Lincoln was still able to get the majority of the Electoral College votes, but there were 4 main candidates. And so prior to that point, the reason why it was so much easier to do that was because elections were ran by the political parties and the people, essentially, not by state legislatures, not by the politicians. So if you wanted to start, let's say we'll use the example of the People's Party. They would print out their own ballots. What they would do is, as long as they could get enough money to get the word out there, if they could campaign and get the word out there, which oftentimes takes money to get the word out there. And if they had the money to print their own ballots, they could craft their own ballots, print them up, distribute them, and say, turn this ballot in. Now, this was an era before primaries. So political parties would just decide on their candidates. Maybe there would be, maybe some political parties would get together in cigar smoke filled rooms, right? And say, well, this is going to be the person who's going to be president. And here's all the other offices that we have on our ticket. That might have happened, but there were no real political primaries at this point. Political parties would get their tickets together. They would then distribute ballots. They would try to get ballots into as many hands as Americans as they possibly could. So a lot of them would print the ballot in the newspaper if they could get with a newspaper, a media company. And this is where it also gets really challenging. They'd have to find a newspaper organization that maybe aligned with them, that were sensitive to their political desires, maybe that were on their team. And they would get them to print the ballot in the newspaper, and people would just cut it out. And they would fill out the ballot and they would turn it in on election day. So the ballot was not controlled by the government. The ballot was actually controlled by political parties. So as long as a political party could get enough ballots out there, and if they could get the word out there and get enough momentum, then they had a real shot at winning offices. So it wasn't up to state legislatures. It wasn't up to sitting incumbent politicians to make the rules. It was just up to these political parties and the people. So it was a lot easier for third parties to rise up, especially if they just had, like I said, some momentum behind them. People were excited about the candidates, or they were excited about what they stood for. There was maybe some money involved so that they could get the word out, that they could get, access. Now, these days, if it were running like that, it would be a little bit easier with social media if big tech weren't shutting down certain political parties, calling them fake news and misinformation, which is probably what would happen today. But that is how third parties were able to rise up. And we had these sort of competing parties in America, really from the time of our country's founding all the way up until, for about 100 years, we had a system like this. Now, there were some issues, obviously, with that when you're going to be dealing with political parties printing out their own ballots. There's going to be some, there's issues with that they ran into, which is why they ultimately decided that there was going to be some reform of the system. So in the late 1800s, the political leaders got together and they decided to reform the system and take the control of the ballots away from the political parties and instead make those a state-run government endeavor. So now the government and the states would issue out the ballots to the people rather than the various different political parties. Well, when you do that and you have 2 political parties entrenched in each state, what do you think is going to happen when they write the rules of how they're going to decide who was going to be placed on the ballot? Because now, listen, back when you were before this reform, a political party could, before they printed the ballots, they could switch out candidates' names right then and there. I mean, they could figure out who was on the ballot of other tickets for other political parties, and they could switch out their nominees before they went to printing press. So they had all of the leeway. They didn't have to meet state requirements or government requirements of any kind. They had full control over their ballot up to the time they printed the ballot out. Now, when the states took over the ballots, they made rules because they were the ones now in control of printing them. And they said, well, if we're going to print these ballots, before they go to press, we're going to establish some rules as to whose name is going to be placed. What do they have to achieve before they make it onto the ballot? They didn't want a ton of people's names submitted to the ballot. So they started making all of these regulations as to who could qualify to be placed on the ballot. So right then and there, you could sort of see a problem when the government starts to take control over the ballot, because previously, it could just be somebody with somebody you feel passionately about. They're rising up. It's a grassroots movement. People are starting to, there's rumblings. This is kind of how Bernie Sanders even started to rise up, right? No one had really heard of this senator from Vermont, but slowly he started going out there campaigning and people started really talking about him. And there was these rumblings about Bernie Sanders kind of going all across the country. And this is sort of what would happen back before there was this ballot access reform. These political parties would sort of rise up through grassroots movements. But when the government took over the ballot, they would make these rules and they would say, well, in order for you to be printed onto the ballot, we need to do, you need to be submitted XYZ number of days, weeks, or months before the actual ballots are printed. And you have to, and in order to get on the ballot, you have to have collected this many signatures, or you have to have raised this much money, or you have to have this much backing from X, Y, and Z. They made all of these rules. And the problem is the people that were making the rules were people from political parties. They were our elected officials making the rules. The state legislatures were making the rules state by state by state. And of course, they made the rules to favor whichever political party was more in power in each state. So this is where the breakdown of our election system happened. This is when, there was obviously some reform needed with the whole each party printing out their own ballot and people would turn that in the general election. There was some reform obviously needed there. But still, when they took the ballot away from the power of the ballot away from the political parties or away from the people, and they instead turned it into a government issue, the problem is the government then decided who was going to be on the ballot. And of course, the political parties in power ensured that the laws were made in their favor. It was a form of gerrymandering, kind of in a way, right? We know that gerrymandering is meant to keep certain political parties in power. They kind of draw the lines for voting in order to ensure that their party has an advantage. And that is sort of what they did when they created these ballot access laws. So fast forward over 100 years, and these laws have been strengthened. Every so often, the state legislatures would get together and they would make new rules based on, different things that were happening. Once the introduction of political primaries came into play, they needed to make new rules. And they continued to make new rules to the point where now it is extremely difficult for a third party to get on the ballot. The Green Party, which is a very big third party, a well-known third party, I think everybody in America knows about the Green Party, is still not on the ballot in all 50 states. In fact, I think the only third party currently on the ballot in all 50 states is the Libertarian Party, and that's it. It's very difficult to get ballot access. Every single state has their own rules, and every territory has its own rules to get on the ballot. And some of them say, well, you have to have gained this meant much percentage in a previous election or have had this happen in a different election. And so when they start basing the rules, it's state by state and you have to know all 50 states rules and they're all different. And some states will say, well, it's based on fundraising and signatures. And some states might say it's based on previous elections and how well you did on those previous elections. And so it's really difficult in an era like now, when so many people are wanting a third party to rise up. It's difficult to just create one from scratch and then get on the ballot in all 50 states. It's very difficult to do this. This is why the unity movement, and I believe, was it Brett Weinstein or was it Eric? I think it was Brett. It was Brett Weinstein who wanted to start the Unity 2020 movement, where he was saying we could take a candidate from the Republican Party, a candidate from the Democratic Party, stick them on a ticket together and have them run. And then in order to gain ballot access, his idea was they would petition the Green Party and the Libertarian Party in each state and ask for that combo to be placed on their ticket. So they wouldn't create a third party because ballot access is a bitch. What they would do instead is they would go to state by state and figure out which third party already had ballot access in that area and ask if they could have their candidates run on their ticket for their political party. That's the only way to kind of have a sudden uprising of a third party ticket. Otherwise, starting a third party is something that takes a very long time. And you can't just suddenly have, like if Donald Trump decides tomorrow he wants to start a third party after all, and he's going to do what he was calling it the Patriot Party or something like that. So if Donald Trump says, oh, we're going to do the Patriot Party, that makes it very, very difficult because there's no ballot access whatsoever for the Patriot Party. There might be some states where he's able to spend enough money in order to gain professional petitioners to go out there and gain enough signatures, spending gobs and gobs of money in order to go out there canvassing, trying to gain enough signatures to get on the ballot in certain states. But even then, you'd only get on the ballot in maybe half of the states. I believe this was already attempted. There was a billionaire who wanted to run for office and ended up paying a ton of his own money for professional petitioners. I can't remember the name of the person. It was fairly recently. And still was only able to get ballot access in, I believe, 27 of the states out of 50. So it was a failed endeavor. And then on top of it, in order to do that, you would need to have somebody put gobs and gobs of money into it. So suddenly you're sort of defeating the purpose of the reason why people want a third party in America. People want a third party because they're sick of our bought off two-party system where we've got politicians on both sides of the aisle who are totally corrupted and bought off. Well, the problem is, in order to start a third party, you need a ton of money in order to gain enough signatures, in order to gain enough awareness, in order to go through all the different, you got to get lawyers, you've got to get all of this stuff. You need a ton of money in order to get this done. And then suddenly you're having to go beg for money from rich people, which is completely against the entire point of starting a third party that is for the American people to begin with. So, not to say it's impossible, because of course there is a path to it, but it's pretty much impossible. They've made it, the political parties in power, Democrats and Republicans, have fortified over the years to ensure that it's nearly impossible for a third party to rise up and have ballot access in all 50 states. And then on top of it, you've got other rules like debate rules, and you have rules with media organizations, which are already in bed with certain political parties. And so are they going to let you on the debate stage? We saw Ross Perot have a difficult time getting on the debate stage. So getting on the debate stage in order to be in front of all of the American people is also another access issue that third parties face. So it's practically impossible to do. Because of all of these various challenges, it actually makes it impossible, to be quite honest with you. And that is why, I was in the process of even writing a book on this, how we could successfully start a third party in America. And the more research I did, the more I realized, my God, it's not actually possible. And it's devastating how impossible it actually is. In order to change the system, we have to go back state by state in each of our legislatures, and we have to change ballot access laws in each of our states, one by one. There has to be a concerted grassroots effort to specifically change that issue. Not a grassroots effort to get a third party going or raise awareness of a third party, but instead it would have to be a concerted effort to change ballot access laws in each and every state, and potentially how elections are even run, rather than the winner-take-all system saying we want to go towards a ranked choice voting in every single state. There would have to be a concerted effort to say we want to move to ranked choice voting. There would have to be a concerted effort to say we want ballot access reform. There would have to be a concerted effort to say we want to change how debates, how candidates make it onto the debate stage, who hosts the debates. All of that stuff would have to be dealt with before we could actually have a real shot at a third party rising up in this country. That is the big fundamental issue. It's a huge, daunting task. It is David versus the Goliath. It is not exactly possible at this moment to do. It's something that would take probably a couple of decades to get done, at least one decade, to make reform in all 50 states in order to get this to happen. Now, that is not to say there isn't a place for third parties in American politics. There is actually still a place for third parties in American politics, even if the third party has no chance at winning. And that is, a third party is used to pressure. A third party is used to pressure another political party into adopting their platform. And this is usually what ends up happening, which also sort of stifles the rise of a third party. What usually ends up happening is when a third party sort of successfully starts to brew. Just look at Bernie Sanders, for example. This is a good example. Bernie Sanders did not start a third party, but you could almost say it was definitely a divergence from the Democratic Party. And there was definitely a huge base of Bernie supporters in the Democratic Party that were about ready to jump ship with Bernie had Bernie decided to start a third party. Well, the Democratic Party is totally aware of this. So what they had to do was they had to adopt some of the language from Bernie Sanders, and they had to put it into the Democratic Party platform in order to gain enough of the people who, you have the diehard Bernie Sanders people who say absolutely nothing was enough that the Democratic Party could adopt, that they wanted total reform. But you had those Democrats who were teetering. You got a lot of these people that they're unsatisfied with the Democratic Party. They liked Bernie Sanders more, but they didn't hate the Democratic Party. And if the Democratic Party would just show that they would budge on a few things, they would go back to voting for Democrats. There were enough of those people that when the Democratic Party decided to adopt a couple of Bernie Sanders positions, maybe the $15 an hour minimum wage, a couple of things that they felt like they could deal with, that they could, that their donors wouldn't totally scoff at, they adopted some of those, and they knew they would gain back enough of those supporters to where a third party, had Bernie Sanders decided to break away and start one, would not have been viable. And this is usually what happens, is when there's a third party challenge to one of the two major parties, and they see the threat and it smacks them in the face, they eventually just adopt some of those platform ideas and gain a good chunk of those voters back. That's another reason why it's very difficult to start a third party in this country, because you would need the majority of Americans to be fervent supporters of that third party movement, not just fair weather supporters. They would have to be really, really viscerally wanting that third party, because otherwise it's really easy for one of the two major parties to win them back over. And that's, one of the big fundamental problems. So, but it's also not a fundamental problem if you're wanting to make change within one of the current political parties. You could pressure them to change and to adopt. And the only way to really successfully pressure them is to genuinely threaten them with your vote. And not just this half-assed, yeah, I support this third party, but, push comes to shove, I'm going to vote for you because you're better than the other guy. You're the lesser of two evils, or it's either you or the devil. Then I'm going to vote for you every time. You'd have to actually have a third party that rises up and says, we're really not going to vote for you. You'd have to do with the Freedom Caucus, the Republican Freedom Caucus. I believe that they actually withheld their vote from Jeff Boehner as Speaker of the House. They said, if you're going to be part of the Freedom Caucus, you cannot vote for Jeff Boehner to be the Speaker of the House. And they actually withheld their vote. It wasn't a threat. They actually did it. And that is the way to enact that sort of change within the major two-party system, is to have that third party not just threaten, but actually follow through with the threat and say, we will make you lose. We will make you lose unless you adopt our policies or get rid of these politicians that are leading the party and install new leadership and reform the platform. We will actually make you lose. That is the only way a third party is actually successful in this era, the way that the current ballot access laws are and our election laws are. The way a third party can be successful is to pressure the major two parties in a way that's actually meaningful, not pussyfoot around and, when push comes to shove, say, okay, I'm getting too fired up here. Say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just vote for you anyway because it's either you or the spawn of the devil. So, I hate to be the bearer of bad news on that when it comes to third parties, because I know so many people, including myself, would love to see a third party rise up. But really, the only way forward right now is to reform the parties from within. And to understand that and to drastically do it and to have leaders that are actually going to do it. I think a lot of people hoped that AOC and the squad would be ones that would sort of reform the Democratic Party. But a lot of, what they seem to do is just get in there and cozy up to Mama Bear Nancy Pelosi and do more of the same. And we see this also on the Republican side, although there seems to be a chink in the armor on the Republican side of the aisle. So I'm really interested in seeing what happens there, because they are changing. And we're not quite sure what they're going to change into just yet. I mean, it looks like they're moving towards being a party for the people more than they have been in the past. In the past, they've been very much in the pocket of big business and the party for the rich, but they might be changing. And it'll be interesting to see how that outside pressure from the Trump supporting base and the more populist base and the Ron DeSantis supporting base, it'll be really interesting to see how they pressure that Republican Party into shifting into something that represents the people more than the big businesses and the big money. We're going to see if they're successful, but right now that is the most successful option at reform, because we all saw what the Democratic Party did, which was they fortified themselves. The establishment fortified itself and said, we're not letting a hijacking happen of this political party. And now, we're stuck with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who's going to be the next candidate, and there will be no primary. Kamala Harris is the next nominee. And it looks like they're even lining up Pete Buttigieg to be the next one after that. It's going to be a Harris-Buttigieg ticket. And, they're lining them up so that they've ripped away the option for us to have a primary and have another Bernie Sanders uprising again. They're putting the kibosh on that very quickly. So that is why there cannot be a third party really truly rise up in America. And it's probably what somebody sat down and sort of explained to Trump, probably in fifth grade language, why a third party cannot actually be viable. There's too many laws and regulations and hurdles to get through. And the only real way forward, I think, is to hijack one of the political parties and reform it from within. And at this point, guys, I don't care which one gets hijacked and reformed. Doesn't matter. The parties have flip-flopped back and forth for a really long time. So there's no, I know a lot of people are kind of stuck in their mindset of, no, the Democrats are one way or the Republicans are another way. And that's just not true. They can change, they can morph, they can be hijacked, and they can be shifted into whatever we want if we, the people, decide. But we've got to get together as one big force and make that decision.